Welcome back to the Thom Hartmann Program. I'm Danielle here with Shano sitting in for Tom today. And you may recall yesterday I mentioned that there was a Taliban attack in Kandahar airport that left 37 civilians and one Afghan army soldier dead. And despite that, we don't have droves of lawmakers tweeting and commenting and telling everybody to share their thoughts and prayers, because that is an everyday occurrence in the countries that we have invaded. Joining us to talk about just that and the statistics that show how we may be doing the wrong thing if we really want to stop terrorism is Paul Gottinger, independent journalist. You can check him out on Twitter at Paul Gottinger. Thank you so much for joining us, Paul. Excellent piece that I have, reader-supported news here about how the war on terror actually creates more terror. Please tell us about it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. It's nice to be here. So basically the piece that I wrote, this has actually appeared back in September, was an analysis of the State Department's own figures, and found that basically from 2002 until 2014, the incidence of terrorism around the world has increased by 65 times, and the number of people killed by terrorist attacks has increased by 45 times. So you'll obviously, I'm sure it's pretty obvious that this corresponds directly with the time period that the war on terror has occurred. And the majority of these terror attacks have occurred in the countries that have been destabilized by the West. So from 2007 to 2011, almost 50% of the terror attacks took place in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then I think in 2014, basically, I think the only country, Nigeria is the only country in the top 5 countries that are experiencing terror attacks that has not been directly impacted by Western military adventures. So I think you're exactly right. The West policies and the violence and war are really just making the terror problems much worse.
I've heard the expression, and I haven't been able to source it, so I don't know if it's just a common speech or if it's a quote of somebody, that one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. That depending on which way you're looking at a situation, you could side with either party, call one the good guy, one the bad guy. We often talk about terrorism as if we in the media, the general we, as if we're never the bad guys, as if we're just trying to bring goods and services and democracy to everybody, and they're welcoming us with warm, open arms, and yet these few people don't like us. You know, how is it that we don't view ourselves as terrorists to, say, Iraq or Afghanistan, where we've killed 1 to 2 million innocent civilians?
I mean, I think you're exactly right. I mean, it's difficult for any nation is going to try to justify its actions because they want to engage in actions that increase their power and domination. The U.S. is certainly no exception in that regard. So it's important that the population sizes the government and allows them to continue their violence and domination. So it shouldn't be surprising, but it is very destructive, and it's something that we should be working for. And actually, the U.S. has a pretty proud tradition of activism and resistance in regards to militarism, certainly in the 1960s, and it's continued on to the present. So this is something that can certainly be changed.
Yeah, activism that is often not covered by the media, all the way back to the original invasion of Iraq. We all remember the free speech zones set up by George W. Bush, where protesters, 1 million protesters showed up to protest his war policy, yet there wasn't a blip about it in the news. If they're not covering, the anti-war activism and the people who are trying to tamp down the rhetoric, is it possible that the world and Muslim countries, Middle Eastern countries, are only seeing the side that's constantly preaching war, constantly preaching hate, and actually becoming more radicalized because of what our media shows?
I think it's certainly possible. I mean, the depiction that the rest of the world has of the U.S. is primarily from U.S. media and entertainment like Hollywood and things like that. So, and those are going to be a pretty skewed perspective. So I think that, it's important for any prominent, be them entertainment figures or any political figures, to express a more reasonable view towards for U.S. foreign policy. Otherwise, the rest of the world, I think polls already show that they see the U.S. as a leading threat to peace. So, I mean, the U.S. has a pretty long history of engaging in violence in their foreign policy. So any sort of changes in regards to rhetoric or in action, preferably, would be a nice change of pace.
Rhetoric certainly has an effect. I think we all can agree on that. Action, as in the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, obviously had an effect based on your statistics and information presented here. Lots of people right now are calling for boots on the ground in Syria to fight ISIS, that we need to send troops in. Wouldn't that possibly, based on your analysis, have the reversed effect?
Well, yeah, I think that's exactly right. So there's no doubt that the West and the U.S., being the most powerful element of the West, has the power to, wipe ISIS fighters off the battlefield. They could, like Ted Cruz has suggested, they could carpet bomb cities and kill, hundreds of thousands of civilians. But what would happen then?
Right.
The U.S. has occupied, Afghanistan for 14 years, and the Taliban is stronger now than it was when we invaded. So the trajectory here is that each time the U.S. engages in a war against a terror organization, it's almost replaced by one that's worse. So, like, there was, Al-Qaeda, and now there's ISIS. And if we wipe ISIS off the battlefield, what's going to replace it? The grievances that are there, they're not going to disappear. They're actually going to be, increased by a war, a Western war. So, if you were actually playing right into ISIS's hands, if we engage in boots on the ground, increased military, this is what they want. They want instability, which they can use to further recruit fighters to their cause and cause increased stability, which they can use to their benefit.
Now, obviously, people have real fear here in the United States. Whether or not it's statistically, reasonable or justified is notwithstanding. People are genuinely afraid and they want some type of action. Is there a way or the possibility that we can address that and kind of calm those fears and still deal with a policy that may actually bring about change, that isn't just about blowing something up so that Americans feel better?
Definitely. There's definitely policies that the West in general and the U.S. Specifically can engage in that will decrease incidents of terrorism. The U.S. has done just the opposite, but things like ramping down the war in Syria, that would be a big help. That would alleviate the refugee crisis to a large degree. Really help the stability of the region. Decreasing sectarian tensions. The Western-backed government in Baghdad has been very, divisive and discriminatory towards Sunnis, which increases support for ISIS. There's also extremism is fueled by billionaires in the Gulf, which are U.S. allies. The kind of Wahhabization of Sunni Islam is also a major problem. So there's a lot of things that can be done that don't involve, actually the most important things don't involve military force.
Now, what would you say to those calling, I don't understand, and I hope there's enough time for this. I don't know how taking out Assad in Syria and, fighting ISIS are congruent, that we can do those both at the same time. Wouldn't we just be creating another power vacuum? Yet this is a call I hear on, across the spectrum, regardless of political policy. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that U.S. policy in Syria seems pretty confused. There's too many goals, and they are exactly what you said, kind of contradictory. I think, unfortunately, Assad is a monster, but he's most likely here to stay. And the West will have to work with him, work with Russia, work with Iran, work with the Gulf states to try to create some sort of functioning country, at least to some degree, and that may involve Sunni territories being somewhat autonomous. There's a number of ways this can go, but it's quite complicated. But there's a lot that can still be done, I think. Of
course, it is very complicated, and it's not something that we can solve in a 10-minute interview. But I commend you for the journalism and investigation and research that you're doing and putting together. These are statistics that Americans need to know, and I think it could really change U.S. policy. So, Paul, thank you very much for your amazing work.
Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Paul Gottinger, independent journalist. Check him out at Paul Gottinger on Twitter or readersupportednews.org. Really, really amazing statistics that you need to learn and you need to help make sure that other people know as well. We'll be right back.
To watch more clips from our programs, hit the Watch More Videos button over here. And please be sure to hit the handy-dandy subscribe button so you'll always be up to date. Tag, you're it.